Hi everybody and welcome to Skeptics of the Pub Online. When the coronavirus pandemic started last year, we weren't content to go months or even years without our talks on science, reason and critical thinking. So we set up Skeptics of the Pub Online and we put on a series of talks here. Throughout the last year and a half, we've built up a great community, including our talks, our Discord server and our After Talk pub. Details of how to join these will hopefully be in the chat. If you like what we're doing and would like to support us, then please visit sitp.online/donate. Our usual format, we will have a talk, followed by a short break, then a Q&A, and then the virtual pub at the end, the lock-ins razor. If you'd like to ask a question, then please visit sitp.online/ask, where you can see what questions have been asked and vote for your favourite. Tonight's speaker is Professor Cyrus Patell. He's a professor of English at NYU and currently Global Network Professor of Literature at NYU Abu Dhabi, where he teaches courses on world literature, cosmopolitanism, global Shakespeare, and literary theory. His book, Lucasfilm, Filmmaker and Philosopher, was published by Bloomsbury last August. Together with Deborah Lindsay Williams, he is co-editing Volume 8 of the 12-volume Oxford History of the Novel in English on the US novel since 1940, which is currently in production. I'm currently really looking forward to this one, so I'm going to get out of the way and let our speaker have the stage. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Professor Cyrus Patell.
Thank you, Dave, for that very kind introduction, and I am really psyched to be here in the virtual pub with all of you to talk about two subjects that are really close to my heart. One of them is critical thinking, and the other one is Star Wars. So let's get started, and let's start with the question that serves as the subtitle for my talk today. Why must Luke Skywalker turn off his targeting computer in order to destroy the Death Star in the first Star Wars film? And I'm going to answer this question in a way that might seem at first to be counterintuitive. I want to suggest that Star Wars, a film that depicts advanced technology beyond anything that we currently have on Earth, and that set in motion a revolution in special effects technology, is actually a Luddite fiction that is deeply wary of the ways in which technology can damage or corrupt human beings. And then I'm going to suggest that this analysis can serve as a case study in the ways that Star Wars has evolved not only into a transmedia phenomenon that spans films, now television series, books, comic books, games, toys, food, but also into a platform for public philosophizing that can promote critical thinking. And not only about Star Wars, but also about the very many ideas that it dramatizes. So, why must Luke turn off his computer to destroy the Death Star at the climax of the film that's now called Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope? Now, we know the answer to that question within the narrative framework that George Lucas establishes for us during the film. Darth Vader tells us why. Scoffing at an Imperial general's contention that the battle station known as the Death Star is the ultimate power in the universe, Vader proclaims, "Don't be too proud of this technological terror you've constructed. The ability to destroy a planet is insignificant next to the power of the Force." Okay, but why create this narrative logic at all? What larger ideological contexts lie behind it? What set of cultural hopes and anxieties underlie the mythology of the Jedi and their relationship to the Force? I want to suggest that a crucial component of the cultural logic that animates not only the Star Wars films from 1977 until now, but also, say, the various Star Trek series and a host of other popular late 20th century and early 21st century representations of advanced technology, is in fact technophobia, the fear of technology. And I think these representations are symptomatic of deep anxieties about the erosion of individual agency, and that they have a long history in Western culture. But I'd suggest that they've become intensified by the rapidity of technological change in the late 20th century. So let's look at a few examples of films which followed in the wake of the first Star Wars film. There's Steven Spielberg's film, E.T., the Extraterrestrial from 1982, which plays on our fears of technology. In the tense final half hour of the film, we assume that the men in the hazmat suits seeking to find E.T. are up to no good. They're not, but the film plays with the tension. The Terminator series of films, which began in 1984, depict the attempts of an artificial intelligence named Skynet to wipe out humanity. Or the Transformers television series and subsequent blockbuster films feature giant robots from outer space, many of which are out to destroy humankind. One of my favorites, the Marvel series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., in its 4th season, pit our heroes against a malevolent AI described as an LMD, a life model decoy, and here she is. Incredulous that anybody would create such a thing, one agent asks another, "Haven't these people seen any movies from the 1980s? The robots always attack." But I'm here to tell you it wasn't just the 1980s, and it wasn't just robots. For example, the film Titanic may be a sentimental and tragic love story, but it has a deep undercurrent of technophobia running within it. It is, after all, a story about a technological disaster caused by scientific hubris, the unsinkable ship that fails to live up to its billing. In fact, the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, played in the film by Victor Garber, tells Rose DeWitt Bukater, played by Kate Winslet, "I'm sorry that I didn't build you a stronger ship, young Rose." Or another set of films that people might know, The Lord of the Rings. They're at least in part about the dangers of industrialization. This particular slide shows what Isengard looks like after Saruman the Wizard tears down its surrounding forest to manufacture his Uruk-hai warriors and their weapons. And indeed, the films, like the novels they came from, in fact dramatize the struggle to acquire what amounts to a manufactured superweapon, the One Ring to rule them all. A couple of others. One of my favorites, Spider-Man from 2002 and Spider-Man 2 from 2004. Here, Peter Parker develops his strange new powers after being bitten by a genetically engineered super spider, and this is an update from the radioactive spider that was in the original comic books. And the Green Goblin and Doc Ock, the villains, are the results of new military technology gone awry. Or Avatar from 2009. It's about the misuse of technology by a greedy corporation intent on strip mining a planet full of natural marvels. And although I'm a Star Trek person, I'm also a Star Trek person. And Star Trek, which is one of the most successful science fiction series of all time, also features a similar undercurrent of technophobia. Now, although the original Star Trek series did celebrate the technological advances that were making space travel a reality in the 1960s, the show frequently dramatized the need for technology to remain under human control, a theme that marks all of the subsequent Star Trek films and television series. In fact, this theme is the motivation behind the first episode I ever saw when, as a kid, I discovered Star Trek reruns back in the 1960s. The Doomsday Machine, in which the Enterprise discovers a planet-killing superweapon that has long outlived its makers, probably after destroying them. And another favorite episode was The Ultimate Computer, in which control of the Enterprise is given over to a computer designed to make William Shatner's Captain Kirk surplus to requirements. Now, I have to say that my own love of these two episodes in particular is probably due to my own technophilia, my love of technology. I loved seeing episodes in which the starships other than the Enterprise were shown, or in which the Enterprise was shown engaged in space battles. In the follow-up series, Star Trek The Next Generation, one of the central characters is Brent Spiner's Lieutenant Commander Data, an android who desperately wants to be human despite the fact that he doesn't have an emotion chip. And a reliable episodic formula? Data runs amok for some reason and needs to be controlled. And this was a reliable formula to which the series periodically returned. Any of you who might be watching the latest Star Trek shows knows that technophobia is a driving force behind them too. In the second series, for example, of Star Trek Discovery, a rogue artificial intelligence has decided to wipe out all non-machine intelligence from the galaxy. The first season of Star Trek Picard is all about a technophobic ban on androids by the Federation and the consequences that ensue. Would it surprise you to know that the Romulans are even more technophobic than the Federation in this series? And of course that Captain Picard is a champion for the androids? These films and television series are, I think, just the tip of an iceberg, to invoke Titanic again. The deep-seated fear that humanity will be unable to control the technologies that it creates, I think, is an abiding theme of Western culture, but also of the history of at least Hollywood motion pictures. Moreover, Star Wars A New Hope was one of a number of films released in the late 70s and early 80s that promoted a mythology of rugged individualism based on single combat in which technology was seen as a necessary evil at best. It must either remain firmly under human control or be avoided altogether. I'll give you just a couple of examples of this. In Rocky IV, our hero Rocky Balboa's regimen of chopping down trees, hauling dog sleds, and carrying logs in the snows outside Moscow enables him to defeat a Soviet boxer trained with the latest sports technology. And in the 1987 film Predator, Arnold Schwarzenegger's commando must battle an extraterrestrial hunter of human beings who's equipped with incredibly advanced weaponry and tracking systems. So how does Schwarzenegger's character do it? Of course, by covering himself with mud, building traps made of wooden stakes, and using a bow and arrow. Now, something similar actually occurs in the climactic battle of Return of the Jedi. Mark Hamill remembers that Lucas loved the idea of medieval technology taking down advanced technology. And Lucas himself commented that the Wookiee planet that I created for Star Wars was eventually turned into the Ewok planet in Jedi. I basically cut the Wookiees in half and called them Ewoks. I didn't make Endor a Wookiee planet because Chewbacca was sophisticated technologically, and I wanted the characters involved in the battle to be primitive. Why? Because low-tech is the mark of the true individualist. We like it that the Millennium Falcon is ramshackle and that every now and then Han needs to pound his fist on its panels in order to make it work more or less properly. And you'll remember, if you've seen it, that when the ship is introduced in The Force Awakens, Rey calls it garbage and wants to find a different ship so that she and Finn can make their getaway from the stormtroopers who are pursuing them. Interestingly, the example of the Millennium Falcon suggests that technophobia is often a response to, and therefore is accompanied by, frequently, its opposite, technophilia, the love of technology. Now, as Isaac Asimov once pointed out, any technological advance, however fundamental, has the double aspect of good and harm, and in response is viewed with a double aspect of love and fear. And Asimov gives two examples of early technological advances within primitive human cultures: the controlling of fire and the making of weapons. Fire warms you, he writes, gives you light, cooks your food, smelts your ore, and out of control burns and kills. Your knives and spears kill your animal enemies and your human foes, and out of your control are used by your foes to kill you. Technology can be celebrated, but only as long as it remains instrumental. The successful special effects film, like Star Wars itself, might represent an example of the proper use of technology. Now, there's a name for this attitude towards technology, and it's this: Luddism. All right, thought experiment. Imagine an empire ruled over by a man whom some accuse of being a tyrant and others describe as being mad. To counteract the rising crime rate brought about by overcrowding in slums, widespread disease, high food prices, the imperial authorities enforce what's popularly known as the Bloody Code. It lists more than 200 crimes that are punishable by death. By far the majorities are crimes against property rather than against persons. The code is designed to eliminate what the upper echelons of society consider to be an unredeemable criminal class. Children are executed for stealing spoons, and inevitably, there's a rebellion. Now, this description might remind you of the universe depicted in the original Star Wars trilogy. But in fact, the empire that I have in mind existed not so long ago, and not so very far away. Its ruler wasn't named Palpatine. It was named George. And the capital of this empire wasn't Coruscant, it was London. And the rebellion in question is neither the one led by Leia, Luke, and company, nor the one led by those who signed the Declaration of Independence in the American colonies. It is rather the Luddite Rebellion, which erupted in Nottinghamshire in 1811 when stocking knitters broke into workshops and sabotaged the wide-frame machines that were threatening their livelihoods. Now today, the term Luddite has come to signify an irrational hatred of technology and progress. But recently, historians have argued that the Luddites were not opposed to machines and technology per se. What they opposed was the use of machines to establish a system of economic and social domination. After all, those who became Luddites had worked since the 16th century on relatively complex machines. But these were machines that could be used by a single individual, and they were part of a framework knitters, and they were able to be used in single cottages of a small shop. In the early 19th century, however, these artisans saw their way of life threatened by the introduction of large-scale machines housed in massive buildings. That automated a good deal of the weaving process, and they recognized that these machines threatened to transform what had been the product of artisans into something that could be mass-produced. It's interesting that at the moment that I'm talking about Luddism, there's some weird technological going on in the pub behind me. I'm just going to go take a look and see maybe what it is. Oh, it seems to have stopped. This happened to me years ago, but that's another story that I can tell when I was also giving a talk about technophobia. Now, what the Luddites were protesting was the beginning of industrialization and the exploitation of labor that it would bring with it. Now, similar attitudes, interestingly, can be found among British military men with the introduction of the machine gun in the 19th century. In his book, The Social History of the Machine Gun, John Ellis argues that the machine gun, though it was invented in 1862, was not used widely until World War I because of an anti-machine mindset among the officer corps of Western Europe, which was drawn primarily from landed gentry rather than industrialists. Recognizing that machines had brought with them industrialization and the destruction of traditional social order, these officers felt that they had to hold the line, at least on the battlefield. And Ellis writes that machines, they thought, must not be allowed to undermine the old certainties of the battlefield, the glorious charge, and the opportunities for individual heroism. Now, George Lucas's Jedi embody the kind of individual heroism that these officers want to preserve and promote. And we need to remember that the Jedi don't eschew technology altogether. Of course, no Jedi feels dressed without his or her lightsaber. But the first time that we see a lightsaber, when Obi-Wan gives Luke his father's lightsaber in the first act of the first Star Wars film, Obi-Wan calls it an elegant weapon for a more civilized time. As the lore around lightsabers develops in Star Wars storytelling, these turn out to be personal and handmade weapons. Each Jedi is an artisan who designs and fashions his or her own weapon. And in fact, the construction of the lightsaber, we learn, signifies the culmination of a Jedi's training. When Luke is brought before Darth Vader late in Return of the Jedi, you'll remember that the Imperial officer who hands him over says he was armed only with this, giving Vader Luke's lightsaber as if it were an insignificant thing. But Vader knows what the weapon signifies. I see you have constructed a new lightsaber, he tells Luke. Your skills are complete. The Jedi's attitude towards the lightsaber thus resemble the attitudes held by the original Luddites. Now, what's at stake in the Luddite rebellion, and in the rebellion that the Star Wars films imagine, is the attempt to preserve and promote individual agency, and to instill an attitude towards technology that harkens back to the conceptions of art and skill that are a part of the etymology of the term technology. Technology is supposed to be about designing tools, machines, and techniques that can make us more skillful, that enhance our ability to affect our intentions, to act in the world. It's supposed to extend individuality and agency. But does it? Are we compromised if we use a tool rather than our own two hands? Can we take full credit for our achievements if we need technological assistance? I mean, we probably, right, wouldn't consider somebody who uses, say, a computer-aided design program to create an image to be as true an artist as someone who uses pencil and paint. And we don't allow athletes to take advantage of biotechnological advances such as steroids. In fact, that last example suggests a further fear that we might actually be damaging ourselves as we use technology. Is it possible that reliance on technology erodes our ability to be self-reliant, to be independent, to be autonomous? Does it compromise our very identity? I think that storytelling in Star Wars asks us to think about these questions. Now, of course, another sign that Star Wars isn't simply technophobic, or at least isn't simplistically technophobic, is its portrayal of the droids, C-3PO and R2-D2. Lucas's depiction of robots and artificial intelligence is one of the ways in which he challenged the horizon of expectations established by the most famous science fiction film before Star Wars, Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film, 2001, with its malevolent computer HAL. Indeed, the portrayal of droids in Star Wars marks a departure from Lucas's own previous science fiction film, THX 1138 from 1971, which featured robot police who were cold and mechanical. Lucas signaled the difference by calling the robots in Star Wars not robots, but droids, in order to avoid the negative connotations that have tended to accompany the word robot since its first appearance in the 1921 play R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, by the Czech playwright Karl Čapek. And in fact, the word robot was coined by Čapek's brother Josef from the Czech word robota, which meant forced labor or servitude. But rather than serving as objects of fear or something to be oppressed or used, the primary droids in Star Wars serve as heroes who constitute an important part of the saga's appeal. In fact, in his foreword to Anthony Daniels' autobiography, Anthony Daniels was the actor who played C-3PO, the director J.J. Abrams remembered that it was the presentation of the droids that he first met when he was 10 years old that was a crucial part of the film's effect on him. Describing the scene aboard Princess Leia's blockade runner, Abrams writes that what happens next is most important. We fall in love with the droids. Near the instant, he writes, we meet stalwart droids C-3PO and R2-D2, we laugh. They become our way into a galaxy we are desperate to be part of. The droids C-3PO and R2-D2, you'll remember, are the only characters who appear in each of the 9 films of the Skywalker saga, and the sequel trilogies BB-8 and D-O serve, like the original droids, as an ethical index. The good guys treat their advanced droids as sentient individuals worthy of respect and protection. The bad guys use their droids as interchangeable and disposable robots. I mean, think of the treatment of droids in the Phantom Menace and the prequel trilogy, or the treatment of the droids by the Empire, or the First Order, or in the sequel trilogy, the shady characters Unkar Plutt and here, Tito, who just think of a droid as something they can salvage for parts. Contrast that, then, with the fact that the good guys call their droids by nicknames, affectionately, R2, 3PO, and think about the real affection that Han Solo has for his ramshackle ship, the Millennium Falcon. In fact, the film Solo is an example of the evolution of thinking about machines and droids that happens as Star Wars storytelling progresses. Here, in this film, Solo, we learn that Han's personification of the Falcon isn't merely the sentimental personification that ship's captains have long used in referring to their ships with feminine pronouns. In fact, the Falcon's computer turns out to be an amalgam of 2 artificial intelligences, its original droid brain and the brain that has been salvaged from the free-thinking droid L3, whom the film has depicted affectionately as Lando Calrissian's erstwhile and female buddy and co-pilot who agitates for droid rights. In the first film, regarding droids as unimportant turns out to be a mistake that ultimately leads to the fall of the Empire. I mean, remember, C-3PO and R2 are able to escape to the planet Tatooine with the Death Star plans because the Imperials aren't looking for droids. An escape pod was jettisoned during the fighting, but no life forms were aboard, an officer tells Darth Vader, who nevertheless realizes that the plans must have been there. Life forms? The first words that we hear 3PO utter when we see him and R2 on the planet indicate that he, at least, considers himself to be a life form. "Oh, how did we get into this mess? I really don't know how," he says. "We seem to be made to suffer. It's our lot in life." Interestingly, the droids didn't exist in the first treatment for the 1977 film, which instead featured two Imperial bureaucrats modeled after the two farmers in Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress. They were there for comic relief. Later, though, as he began to flesh out the universe that he was imagining, Lucas decided to focus on the droid as the lowest person, he said, on the pecking order, basically like the farmers in The Hidden Fortress. Now, the low standing of the droids becomes clear quickly when our heroes walk into, well, this place, the Mos Eisley Cantina. I mean, right? You can see it's full of all kinds of exotic non-humans. And this cantina seems like a kind of cosmopolitan place, right? But the bartender points to the droids and tells Luke, "We don't serve their kind here. They'll have to wait outside. We don't want them here." Now, as the film progresses, we learn just how unenlightened the bartender's attitude is, as the droids establish themselves as heroic characters who are crucial to the rebellion's success and to the films. Interestingly, the makers of the television series The Mandalorian, which debuted in 2019, make an ironic joke about this scene by having its protagonist return to this same cantina in the aftermath of Jabba the Hutt's demise and the Empire's defeat. Apparently, Tatooine hasn't fared so well with all those things happening, and now, actually, it's a droid who's the bartender. At the same time, the Star Wars films themselves actually respect droids by allowing some of them to actually be bad guys with intention. The Battle and Destroyer droids, to be sure, fight against the Jedi on the side of the Separatists in the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars television series. But as the storytelling goes on, there are actually droids that have negative, evil even, intentionality. I mean, in the sequel trilogy, it's literally a dark version of BB-8, known to those who care as BB-9E, who exposes Finn, Rose, and DJ to the evil First Order in The Last Jedi. But even go back to The Empire Strikes Back. One of the bounty hunters that Darth Vader assembles to track down Han Solo and Princess Leia is the droid IG-88, shown here in the middle of this scene. And this droid would become a fan favorite in the expanded universe stories, leading to the inclusion of a similar bounty hunting droid, IG-11, in the live-action television series The Mandalorian. Interestingly, unlike most of the good guys, or we think they're good guys, in the Star Wars universe, The Mandalorian actually hates droids. Because, as we learn from flashback scenes, battle droids killed his parents when he was a child, leading to his adoption by Mandalorian warriors. And my favorite, the comic series Dr. Aphra from Marvel, goes so far as to include two psychotic killer droids, mass murderers, who happen to be the same models as 3PO and R2. I'll note in passing, though, that what the Star Wars saga doesn't depict, in contrast to, Star Trek, is a beloved droid character turning bad either due to a programming malfunction or being hacked. The innate fear of the dangers of artificial intelligence that we see in fictions like RUR, 2001, Star Trek, The Terminator, or The Matrix just isn't an abiding fear in the Star Wars saga. Again, like the Luddites before them, what motivates the good guys in the Star Wars films is not the fear of technology per se, not even at its most advanced form in the form of artificial intelligence, but rather the fear that technology will be misused to enhance the agency of the few at the expense of the many. The Star Wars films, I think, suggest that human beings need to develop a healthy relationship to the technologies they create by recognizing the responsibilities that accompany the creation of advanced technologies. Indeed, the depiction of the droid suggests that once we create artificial intelligences, we need to respect them as intelligences and not denigrate them as artificial. You treat droids like R2 and 3PO with respect and dignity, Star Wars tells us, and they'll reciprocate. Now, I think the depiction of technology is just one of the ways in which the Star Wars saga moves beyond the black and white representations associated with melodrama to explore gray areas. And I want to suggest now that that interest in gray areas was present even in that first film from 1977. So let's take a moment and see how that works. Now, melodrama encourages black and white thinking, and thus would seem to be a way in which films that use it can discourage their audiences from engaging in our subject, which is critical thinking. And in fact, the first Star Wars film makes significant use of melodrama, in part through its use of John Williams' music. And of course, we should remember that the term melodrama was first used to denote simply a play that made significant use of music to accompany its action. Only later did it evolve into the meaning that we have now. Lucas was well aware of how music, together with costume and scene design, can create the kind of sorting into good and bad that seems to be a primary function of melodramatic representation. Mark Hamill remembers watching the filming of the scene where Darth Vader makes his first appearance in Star Wars A New Hope and asking Lucas, well, in the script, aren't you going to cut to two characters saying, well, who's that? Oh, that's the Dark Lord of the Sith. And he's, some exposition. And Hamill says, Lucas just casually said, yeah, we'll play he's dressed in black, and we'll play some scary music, and they'll know he's the bad guy. The ready identification of Vader as a bad guy, along with scary music that recalls the melodramatic Flash Gordon serials of the 1930s that inspired Lucas, enables the scene to fulfill what the literary scholar Peter Brooks describes as the imperative of melodrama, making the world morally legible, spelling out its ethical forces and imperatives in large and bold characters. Now, although the Star Wars films seem at first glance to create a Manichaean worldview in which existence is a constant battle between the light side and the dark side of the Force, personified in the enmity between the Jedi and the Sith, the films actually complicate the ostensibly black and white moral structures that seem to be put in place by the use of melodramatic structures. I'd suggest one way is the use of verbal humor, which acts as a kind of deflationary counterweight to melodramatic hyperbole and exaggeration. In the first film, much of this verbal humor arises from the interplay between Han and C-3PO. Han, with whom we tend to laugh, and C-3PO, to whom we direct a kind of affectionately ironic perspective. But there's one moment of high drama when Obi-Wan is trying to disarm the tractor beam so that the Millennium Falcon can escape from the Death Star, where the tension is heightened through the use of verbal comedy, which arises in this case from some banal conversation between stormtroopers. Obi-Wan is trying to deactivate the tractor beam, and the script tells us that suddenly behind him, a detachment of stormtroopers marches to the power trench, and Obi-Wan remains in the shadows as they move to within a few feet of him. The officer says, "Give me regular reports, please." And the first trooper says, "Yes, right." And then all but two of the stormtroopers leave. So it's just two troopers and Obi-Wan. And we get this conversation. "Do you know what's going on? Maybe it's another drill." And then the first trooper asks the second one, "Have you seen the new VT-16? "Yeah, some of the other guys were telling me about it." Now, this conversation is interrupted when Obi-Wan needs to escape, and so he uses the Force to create a noise. And the second trooper said, "What was that?" And the first trooper says, "Oh, it's nothing. Top gassing. Don't worry about it." Now, I think this brief exchange makes us realize something. It's not just funny, not just heightening the drama, but it makes us realize that there are some real people, some guys, beneath those skull-like helmets. There's another moment in the first film that uses humor to humanize the stormtroopers. When a group of 4 stormtroopers breaks into the control room where C-3PO and R2-D2 have been hiding, the 4th one famously hits his head on the door walking in. You can see it there on the right side of the screen. The stormtrooper is hitting his head on the door just over the front stormtrooper's left shoulder. Lucas not only left in the shot, but he accentuated the moment by adding a sound effect so that we actually hear the helmet banging against the door. I think these little moments are there to create an invitation to think beyond the black and white of melodrama. And as the Star Wars universe has unfolded in subsequent films and other media, it's played much more with those gray areas that classic melodrama seeks to obscure. I'll give you some examples. The blue-skinned Grand Admiral Thrawn, a character created by novelist Timothy Zahn in the trilogy of novels that began the original Star Wars expanded universe in 1991, this character was resurrected as a chief antagonist in the animated series Star Wars Rebels, which are a canonical part of the Star Wars universe today. But the first 3 novels that Zahn wrote to extend the representation of Thrawn in the new canon offer readers a dramatization of life inside Palpatine's empire before the rise of the Rebel Alliance. In fact, the epilogue of the 3rd book, and this isn't much of a spoiler, uses a limited third-person narration to actually take us briefly into the mind of Emperor Palpatine himself. The female protagonist of the game, Battlefront 2, Eden Versio, is a die-hard Imperial officer. In the game's companion novel, Battlefront 2, Inferno Squad, we learned that Versio has survived the destruction of the first Death Star. She was returning to it when it blew up, and she regards it as a terrorist act that has caused the death of 1 million Imperial soldiers and citizens. The 2019 canonical comic series TIE Fighter presents this point of view, and it presents the point of view of the Imperial pilots of Shadow Wing, who are, they think, battling to restore peace to the galaxy. In fact, one of them says, referring to the rebels at one point, the point is that they're the ones who started this war. Destroying that battle station was mass murder. Now, for comic book readers, these pilots are made even more sympathetic if the comic book readers have also read Han Solo, Imperial Cadet, which portrays Han's time in the Imperial Flight Academy. It introduces us to some of these pilots who become part of Shadow Wing. Meanwhile, in the series Alphabet Squadron, we see the difficulties that a defector from the Empire has when she tries to adjust from the Empire's ordered regime to the comparative chaotic world of the rebellion. One more example. In director Jon Favreau's live action television series, The Mandalorian, which premiered to acclaim in 2019, the title character is a bounty hunter whose depiction is inspired by Clint Eastwood's anti-heroic Man with No Name from those westerns. And according to Carl Weathers, who plays the head of a guild of bounty hunters, the Mando is a character who does what needs to be done. I think these representations complicate the original trilogy's deployment of the melodramatic imagination. The first Star Wars film makes use of archetypes and cinematic devices associated with Hollywood melodrama, especially the Western, that enable its audiences to wholeheartedly get behind Luke and his pals and to cheer out loud when the Death Star and everyone aboard it are destroyed. But in the little ways I've identified, I think it also gives us the tools to pause, if we're so inclined, to think a little bit more deeply about what separates the good guys from the bad guys. And in fact, that becomes the point of the first trilogy. Luke saves the rebellion through his passionate belief that there is still some good left in his ostensibly evil mass-murdering father, Darth Vader, a belief that turns out to be true. And as Star Wars has evolved over the years into a transmedia phenomenon, the storytellers who inherited Lucas's vision have become more and more interested in exploring the gray areas to which he pointed. Okay, so let's return for a moment to the idea of the lightsaber. The saga as a whole culminates with the revelation in the final scene of The Rise of Skywalker that Rey, like Luke in Return of the Jedi, has built her own lightsaber, in this case fashioned from the staff that she's been carrying throughout the sequel trilogy, thereby completing her journey to become a Jedi. Now, for much of this time, we're told not much about the mechanics of the construction of lightsabers, certainly not in the original trilogy. In fact, an article on lightsabers in the website Den of Geek argues that the enduring appeal of the lightsaber was enhanced by the sense of mystery that surrounded them. Fans had no idea how they were made, and for the first two films, we only saw three of them: Luke's first one, Obi-Wan's, and Vader's. That's changed. As the Star Wars universe has expanded, we find out more and more details about lightsabers. In Star Wars, the complete visual dictionary, for example, we're shown a cross-section of a lightsaber in a section called Special Technology, and we're given this description, which seems to rely on physics that don't actually exist in our galaxy. Lightsabers tend to follow a basic similar structure, although many are very individualized by their Jedi builders. While the pure energy blade has no mass, the electromagnetically generated arc wave creates a strong gyroscopic effect that makes the lightsaber a challenge to handle. Operating on the principle of tightly controlled arc wave energy, it requires focusing elements, and here's the key term, made of kyber crystals. A lightsaber, they tell us, must be assembled by hand, think the Luddites, think artisans, as there is no exact formula for the crucial alignment of the irregular crystals. The slightest misalignment will cause the weapon to detonate on activation. In fact, an episode from the 5th season of the Clone Wars cartoon series depicts Yoda leading a group of Jedi younglings to the Jedi Temple on the planet Ilum to participate in a ritual called the Gathering, in which they will find the special crystal, the kyber, around which they'll build their first lightsabers. StarWars.com now tells us that this kyber crystal is attuned to the Force and connected to a Jedi Knight on a deeply personal level. In this way, a lightsaber is an extension of a Jedi's Force awareness. Because Jedi let the Force guide their selection of the crystal, the vibration that the crystal creates in the lightsaber blade helps Jedi center themselves and find balance in the Force. In this way, the website tells us, a Jedi can center his attention beyond the distractions of combat. A lightsaber crystal, interestingly, is colorless until first attuned and connected to a Jedi, at which time it glows either blue or green, or in some rare instances, as in Rey's lightsaber, another shade. From that point on, it retains its hue. The canonical novel Ahsoka includes a chapter that's actually written from the point of view of the crystals on the planet Ilum. The book tells us all they had to do was be patient and grow. But kyber crystals are also used by the Sith. The Marvel comic series Darth Vader tells us how the Sith imbue their crystals with the red color that is their hallmark. A red saber is no different than any other, Palpatine tells Vader, except that it has been made to bleed. One of the first tasks in this comic series that Palpatine sets Darth Vader after Revenge of the Sith is to acquire a crystal by killing one of the few remaining Jedi. He tells Vader, the crystal from any Jedi saber will do. As you know, the kybers are alive in their way. Like any living thing, they can feel pain. Through the dark side, you pour your pain into the crystal, and when at last the agony becomes more than it can stand, a beautiful crimson, the color of your rage. Now, these accounts of the construction of lightsabers, I think, extend the idea that the weapon and its wielder exist in a symbiotic relationship by transforming the saber itself into a kind of cyborg, a fusion of something living and something mechanical, once again playing with the boundary that discomfits so many technophobic works of popular culture. I mean, think of the Borg, for example, one of the most popular enemies in the Star Trek universe. Interestingly, the most prominent cyborg in Star Wars is, well, none other than Darth Vader. But then the last film says, well, wait a minute, isn't Luke also a cyborg with his prosthetic hand? And it's that realization that Luke seems to have of that connection to his father that ultimately pushes him over to spare Vader's life, leading to the ending of the film. Again, exploring gray areas. And the more recent film Rogue One provides a further twist. It turns out that it's kyber crystals, in this case mined from the sacred planet Jeddah, that power the Death Star. In other words, the same crystals power both the Jedi's iconic weapon and the Empire's iconic weapon. Ultimately, the depiction of technology that we find in the Star Wars universe resonates with Asimov's assertion, which I quoted earlier, about the interplay of good and harm in any technological advance. Fire warms you, and out of control burns and kills. In other words, fire, like any technology, is neutral. Whether it's used for good or ill depends on who's using it and what their intentions are. I think that, like Asimov, Star Wars seems to argue against the idea of technological determinism. Here's one expression of technological determinism. It comes from Jerry Mander, who wrote a book in 1978, so roughly the same time as the first Star Wars film, that was called Four Arguments in the Elimination of Television. And Mander wrote that Americans have not grasped the fact that many technologies determine their own use, their own effects, and even the kind of people who control them. We have not yet learned to think of technology as having ideology built into its very form. In other words, we might say, technological determinism in the Star Wars sense boils down to this. If you build a Death Star, you're going to use a Death Star, and you're going to be defined by your Death Star. But I think the saga as a whole suggests something else. Not that we're determined by technology, but that technology is an amplifier of human agency, and therefore should worry us for precisely the same reason that we should be worried about humanity generally. Because each human being contains the potential for light and the potential for dark. We exist in gray areas, and we need to be able to think critically, to develop a sense of moral compass in order to navigate between the light and the dark. Now, I think that one of the ways in which Star Wars storytelling promotes the idea of critical thinking is through the embrace of the idea of fallibilism. And let's remember that Star Wars begins with a failure. Princess Leia admits as much in the message that she sends to Obi-Wan when she programs it into R2-D2 at the beginning of New Hope. General Kenobi, the message says, "Years ago you served my father in the Clone Wars. Now he begs you to help him in his struggle against the Empire. I regret that I am unable to present my father's request to you in person, but my ship has fallen under attack, and I'm afraid my mission to bring you to Alderaan has failed." Luke becomes involved in the rebellion in order to help Obi-Wan remedy that failure. Now, Princess Leia's message is the only time that the word fail or any of its derivatives is used in that first film. But as the larger story evolves across the Skywalker saga, those who follow the light side turn out to have an attitude towards failure that approximates what philosophers call fallibilism. The sense, as Kwame Anthony Appiah puts it in his book on cosmopolitanism, that our knowledge is imperfect, provisional, subject to revision in the face of new evidence. Cosmopolitans, in Appiah's account, embrace the idea of fallibilism because they believe that human beings can learn from the moments in which they are shown to be wrong and can increase the limits of their knowledge through the exchange of ideas with others. Indeed, trying, failing, correcting others, and then trying again seems for cosmopolitans to be a crucial part of learning progress. And I think that is what Star Wars is dramatizing for us as the saga has continued. Now, as counter-cosmopolitans, Vader and the Empire have a rather different attitude towards failure. You'll remember that when Vader's fleet comes out of hyperspace in the first act of The Empire Strikes Back, they discover that the rebels are alerted to our presence, and Vader tells the admiral in charge, "You have failed me for the last time," and chokes him to death using the Force. And he does it again later when the ship's captain loses track of the Millennium Falcon in an asteroid field. The First Order in the sequel trilogy seems to have a similar attitude, as we can see in the passage from the novelization of The Last Jedi. True, General Hux thinks, Starkiller Base had been destroyed, but Hux told himself that was merely an unfortunate setback. One that had been less a military defeat than the product of incompetence and treachery within the First Order. Those failures had been dealt with, or near enough. Most of those who had failed Hux and Supreme Leader Snoke had been vaporized with the base, and those who had escaped punishment would get what they deserved soon enough. But interestingly, a couple of pages earlier, we've realized that Princess Leia, now General Organa, has actually learned and put into practice the light side attitude towards failure and imperfection. One of her lieutenants wonders, so what would General Organa do? And she knows the answer. She'd say, perfect information is a luxury you can rarely afford. All you can do is make the best decision with whatever imperfect information you do have. Now, if imperfection is a fact of human existence, then the idea of fallibilism suggests that we have to learn how to turn imperfection from a liability into a strength. Now, interestingly, the imperfections, the special effects, and the sets that Lucas was able to construct in 1977 bothered him over the years and led him to use emerging digital special effects technologies to bring those films closer to his original vision in the revised and controversial special editions. It was that sense of being motivated to fix imperfection that gave him the confidence to attempt the grand storytelling that he'd imagined for his prequel. J.J. Abrams took a different lesson from the idea of imperfection in the original trilogy. In The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, he likes the visual style of imperfection of the original trilogy. Oscar Isaac, who plays Poe Dameron in the sequel trilogy, put it this way when talking about that film's use of location shooting, built sets, and practical effects. It's the things you can't anticipate, Isaac said, the imperfections. It's very difficult to design imperfections, and the imperfections that you have in these environments immediately create a sense of authenticity. You just believe it more. Imperfection, then, and learning how to make use of it has always been a crucial element in both the style and the substance of Star Wars. Interestingly, the authoritativeness with which Yoda trains Luke in The Empire Strikes Back seems to have lulled many fans into thinking that Yoda was somehow infallible. But I think we need to contextualize Yoda's famous dictum, try not, do or do not. There is no try. I think that is a response to Luke's defeatist attitude after his X-Wing sinks into the swamps of Dagobah. When Luke says he'll give raising the X-Wing a try, Yoda's response indicates that he detects a timidity within Luke's idea of trying. And after Luke is unable to perform the feat because he said it's too big, Yoda utters what has become an equally famous line, size matters not. And then he closes his eyes, concentrates, and raises the X-Wing to dry land. Luke exclaims, I can't believe it. And Yoda replies, that is why you fail. Success, Yoda is suggesting, depends on self-belief and a determination to act resolutely, to act more forcefully than merely giving it a try would imply. There's no doing without trying. Fear of failure leads to inaction. As it turns out, the completion of Luke's training doesn't actually happen until near the end of the 9th film, The Rise of Skywalker, well after he's become a Jedi Master and even after he's now become one with the Force. I'd suggest it is the moment when he finally raises an X-Wing from underwater in order to give Rey the tools she needs in order to face and defeat the Empire once and for all. But Yoda, we'll remember, is far from infallible. In Revenge of the Sith, he fails to defeat the Emperor in their climactic lightsaber duel and has to be rescued by Bail Organa, to whom he says, into exile I must go. Failed I have. And then we can think back to The Empire Strikes Back, in which he fails to convince Luke that it's more important to complete his training than to leave and try to rescue Han, Leia, and the droids from Darth Vader's clutches. He implores Luke as he leaves to remember your failure in the cave. But Yoda's failure to convince Luke here turns into be a fortunate development, because it's Luke's decision to disobey Yoda that sets in motion the chain of events that ultimately leads to the redemption of Vader and the defeat of the Empire. The novelization of The Last Jedi makes this point explicit. At a moment when Leia finds herself fearing the prospect of failure, she remembers what her brother had taught her. On this point, Luke had explained he rejected the teachings of the Jedi. The Order had forbidden emotional attachments, warning that they left a Jedi vulnerable to the lures of the dark side. And indeed, it was a love curdled into jealousy and possessiveness that had led their father, Anakin Skywalker, into darkness and despair. But Luke had disagreed with Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi that Anakin was lost to the light. He had insisted that the very emotional entanglements that had led Anakin to become Darth Vader might also draw him back. Again, gray areas. Entanglements such as the stubborn love between a father and son, each of whom had thought the other lost. We need to revise on the basis of new information, right? Luke had been right, the novel tells us, and ignoring his teachers had saved him, the Alliance, and the galaxy. Now, the fans who were the most vocal critics of The Last Jedi were dismayed that it depicted a discouraged Luke Skywalker who had failed to reconstitute the Jedi Order and had hidden himself from his sister and the Resistance for reasons unknown, perhaps to do penance, perhaps to save the galaxy from the consequences of his inability to live up to the mantle of hero, maybe to try to return to the legendary First Jedi Temple in order to learn from his mistakes. But it takes a while to learn. What Luke discovers, or believes he's discovered through his meditations on the planet, is the history of the Jedi's abiding failures. He tells Rey, now they're extinct, the Jedi are romanticized, deified. But if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds from the birth of the Sith to the fall of the Republic, the legacy of the Jedi is failure, hypocrisy, hubris. Luke points out that at the height of their powers, the Jedi allowed Darth Sidious to rise, created the Empire, and to wipe them out. And he adds, it was a Jedi Master who was responsible for the creation and training of Darth Vader. Now, a vocal group of fans have contended that Rian Johnson betrayed George Lucas's legacy by depicting a broken Luke Skywalker, who, as Rey puts it to herself in the novelization, had somehow come to reject not only the Jedi, but his own legacy as well. Having said all that, the film's attitude towards failure in The Last Jedi is lighthearted and playful rather than dour. It doesn't want us to be afraid of failure the way that Luke has come to be. Now, you'll remember that The Force Awakens ended with what seemed to be a portentous moment. Rey finally locating Luke Skywalker and tentatively, imploringly holding out to him the lightsaber that he had lost on Bespin in The Empire Strikes Back. In The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson goes back to that moment and then takes it in a direction that neither Rey nor the audience can foresee. Hamill's Luke takes it in his metallic prosthetic hand, which is now revealed to be metallic. Rey steps back. Luke looks at it as Rey looks on expectantly. The music swells and then abruptly stops to signal a crucial moment. And then, with his non-mechanical left hand, Luke tosses the lightsaber over his shoulder nonchalantly and stalks away. It's not what we expected. It's not what Rey expected. Now, as the film progresses, Luke adopts a sardonically playful attitude towards failure that disguises the depths of his despair. The film's signature one-liner, every word in that sentence was wrong, appears 3 times. Luke says it to Rey before her first lesson in the ways of the Force. Rey paraphrases it back before her second lesson. Being wrong seems to be the starting point on the journey to wisdom. Luke's training of Rey ultimately redeems him because it gives him a chance to remedy his first failures as a teacher with his nephew Ben Solo. Luke's account of what happened on that faithful night when he lost Ben Solo to the dark side of the Force is an account of multiple failures. First, his failure to see the dark side building up in Ben, just as Yoda had failed to see the workings of the dark side all around him, and Obi-Wan had failed to see the growing presence of the dark in Anakin in the prequel trilogy. Second, his failure to control his immediate instincts, leading him to ignite his lightsaber above the sleeping boy. And finally, his recognition that he has failed as a teacher. The last thing I saw, he tells Rey, were the eyes of a frightened boy whose master had failed him. Rey, growing ever wiser, tries to reframe Luke's sense of failure. You failed him, she says, by thinking his choice was made. It wasn't. And she makes it clear that she still believes, as Luke had before, that Ben Solo, who now calls himself Kylo Ren, can be turned back from the dark side. So Luke's encounter with Rey on Ahch-To in The Last Jedi shows us that he still has something to learn, despite all of the world weariness that leads him to tell Rey that it's time for the Jedi to end, a position that he learns to reverse by the climax of the film. And the completion of Luke's own education begins when Rey asks him to rethink the way in which he's Kylo Ren, but it's actually moved along and completed by a surprise visit from none other than his old teacher Yoda. Luke, it seems, hasn't entirely followed Yoda's instruction to pass on what you've learned, perhaps because he never fully understood it. At the time, we're unaware that Rey has taken those ancient Jedi texts. Luke goes to burn down the tree in which they're stores, but he's interrupted by Yoda's manifestation as a Force ghost. I'm ending all of this, he tells Yoda. The tree, the text, the Jedi, I'm going to burn it all down. At the moment of truth, he falters. He fails. And so it falls to Yoda, who is a powerful, even as a Force ghost, concentrating, as in The Empire Strikes Back, with his eyes closed. Yoda lifts his finger, and a strike of lightning sets the tree aflame. Luke is appalled, but Yoda giggles and stamps his feet before saying, "Ah, Skywalker, missed you, have I?" He is still the master instructing a neophyte. Even this late in the game, Luke's impulse is to get the wrong lesson. So it is time, he says, for the Jedi to end. Facing away from Luke and towards the tree, Yoda replies, "Time it is," before pausing and turning around to continue with a rather different idea. For you to look past a pile of old books. Yoda had told Luke and Empire to unlearn what you have learned, but all these years later, that isn't any easier. "The sacred Jedi books," Luke protests, and then Yoda scolds him gently. "Read them, have you? Page turners they were not. Wisdom they held, but that library contained nothing the girl Rey does not already possess." The scene proves to be an epiphany for Luke and changes the apparent meaning of the film's title. So if the Skywalker saga turns on the fraught relationships between parents and their children, it's also, I think, about the fraught nature of the relationship between teacher and student. The end of Yoda's exhortation to Luke on Ahch-To offers a melancholy lesson about the nature of being a teacher, and part of it involves renouncing the pretense to authority and infallibility. "Heeded my words not, did you? Pass on what you have learned. Wisdom, yes, but folly also. Strength in mastery, but weakness and failure, yes. Failure, most of all, the greatest teacher failure is." And then, what might be the hardest thing for a teacher to realize, we are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters. Accepting that we are error-prone beings, but that we can learn from our failures and our mistakes is a bedrock value of what I describe as a cosmopolitan approach to culture, and that's the approach that I think Star Wars asks us to cultivate. In my view, cosmopolitanism is best understood as a perspective to be embraced rather than a problem to be solved. This perspective might be said, I think, to lie behind all great literature, whether textual or visual, which asks its readers and viewers to experience otherness by opening themselves up to another person's words and thoughts, recognizing that because we are all fallible and error-prone, that other people may have a better account of the truth than we do, and we need to test our ideas by listening, by opening ourselves up to other points of view, as in fact Obi-Wan suggests to Luke in Return of the Jedi. I think that great art arises from the kind of cosmopolitanism that I'm describing here, and that great art encourages its viewers and its audiences and its readers to engage in a concomitantly cosmopolitan reading or viewing practice. A cosmopolitan thinker recognizes that engaging with the arts is a social practice. Whenever we encounter a work of imaginative art, we are encountering words, images, thoughts that aren't ours. It's the closest thing, I'd suggest, given our self-enclosed minds, to letting our consciousness merge with someone else's. And we can then realize that meaning-making is a collaborative process. Meaning is the result of a conversation between artist and audience through the medium of art. So I want to close by suggesting that a cosmopolitan audience practice requires us to attune ourselves constantly to the interplay of sameness and difference, of comfort and discomfort in the acts of reading, writing, performing, experiencing texts such as novels, plays, and films. And I offer this advice to those who wish to pursue a cosmopolitan approach to the arts. When you find a text familiar and comforting, look for ways to make it strange, unfamiliar, and different. Produce discomfort in yourself. And when you find a text that makes you uncomfortable, try to locate aspects of sameness to make yourself comfortable with its difference. Be at home with all the texts you encounter, and be at home with none of them. So in its use of melodrama and cutting-edge special effects, In its presentation of a galaxy that seems strangely familiar and lived in, Star Wars has always invited us to feel comfortable with the marvelous and the strange. The fact that it has then invited us to explore the gray areas between light and dark, between good and evil, and that it has spawned such passionate discomfort in many of its self-professed fans is a sign, I think, that it has become something more than a film series, something more than just a global transmedia phenomenon. I think, and as you can see, I've argued, it has become a platform for philosophical debate and critical thinking that enables its participants to engage in the kinds of conversations about hard questions that philosophers describe as the bedrock of a truly cosmopolitan experience. And I'm going to close there and thank you for listening and suggest that maybe it's time for all of us to get a little bit of refreshment. Thank you very much.
Excellent, that was. Thank you so much. We're going to go into a short break now. Gives you all a chance to recharge your glasses, go to the toilet, or join our Discord server. There's still time to ask or vote for your favourite questions at sitp.online/ask. We'll be back at 8:20 for the Q&A, which will then be followed by our virtual Zoom pub. So I'll see you all shortly. Thanks. Hi everybody and welcome back. So hope you'll refresh your glasses, went to the loo, did everything you needed to. We are obviously now going to go into our Q&A with Professor Cyrus Patell. We're going to start off with the regular question that we get, which is, can we see your pets, blah, blah, blah. Cyrus does have a couple of cats. However, they may or may not appear.
They're having blue milk in the back. So if when they finish the blue milk and a little bit of the Ronzo burger, I think maybe they might come. But I did bring my other pet.
I'm now going to give the audience...
This scares the cat, though, so that might mean the cat will not come.
I'm going to give the audience a couple of minutes to fill the chat with crazy emojis and things for the porg. But now they've done that, let's move on to the actual Q&A. So the first question we have comes from San Holo. Well done, whoever you are. So who shot first? Does it matter?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what is your first movie version that you saw. If you saw it when I saw it, it was pretty clear that Han shot first. It's interesting to me that Lucas decided that was one of the things that he changed it, and I've written a little bit about it because I think that's actually a place where he makes it a little bit less subtle as he makes the change. I mean, again, we imagined that the Star Wars was inspired by a number of things, but in part it was the Western. And one of the things that we think about with the Western is that there is a kind of moral code, and that Han Solo was perfectly, right to shoot first when he realized that he was in mortal jeopardy. And when you have a bounty hunter who is armed and has basically said, I've been looking forward to this for a long time, you would be an idiot not to shoot right away. And I don't think that is because what Lucas said is, well, the audience wanted Han to be a killer. And I didn't want the audience to think of that way. I think within the confines of the Western genre, nobody would have thought that it was morally wrong for Han to preserve his life by shooting the bounty hunter who was clearly going to kill him. And I think, who else agrees with me? The people that made, well, not only legions of Star Wars fans, but the people that made the film Solo, who refer back to it, have Han shoot first, in what I think is also maybe a little bit of a nod to that Indiana Jones moment where, the guy comes with the swords and everything and he's like, and shoots him. And I think it's clear. And then Beckett, the guy who he shot, says, you were right to shoot me. I was going to kill you. So I actually think, I think an artist has the right to get that piece of artwork to be the way she or he wants it. And if Lucas wants to make changes, I think that's fine because as you could probably tell from my talk, I think art is not static, and art does change, and its meanings change, and its meanings are in part created by what the creator wants and in part what the audience wants to understand. So I think Lucas has the right to change it, and I think people have the right to prefer the earlier version. I happen to think in this case, he's making a mistake by changing it because he's actually making it a little bit less complex. It's one of these, again, what I'm suggesting is that the films make use of melodrama and then want to push us beyond melodrama. And I think it's an interesting question to think, why, if we adopt the conventions of Westerns, would most people think it was okay for Han to shoot first?
It'd be a completely different scenario if it was an unarmed man or an unarmed woman or even a child. That would be a completely different question. But he's in threat.
That's what I think. But I think it's interesting that it became such a thing for the fans, that it became a lot of their anger about Lucas's making changes got affected onto that moment. And it's funny, he keeps making changes. In the book that I wrote, I went through some of the things. They changed it even for the last thing that went on in Disney Plus. And as many people know, Greedo actually now says something that he didn't say before, which was, makalunky, which means something like your dog meat or something like that in Huttese. And that's a nod to the Phantom Menace. Again, do we need all of that? I don't know. But I mean, does Lucas have the right to do it? I think he has the right to do it. And I think fans have the right to prefer an earlier version. Absolutely. But if Lucas says, this is the way I imagined it, then that's the way he imagined it. So I actually had no problem with the special editions, and I actually thought it was kind of fun to see some of these new editions, not all of which I think were perfect. But then I've never had the attitude that Star Wars is such an indelible part of my growing up that it has to be the way that I remember it. I'm going to say something deeply controversial right now, which is that I think it is great that Disney bought Lucasfilm, and that it has now handed it over to a new generation of filmmakers who care about Star Wars, many of whom will say that I went into movie making because of Star Wars. So it's a funny way in which it's almost like now what we're getting in the new Star Wars stories is official fan fiction. And if you think that these people, and a lot of the fans who disagree with these artistic choices, like, oh, these people don't understand Star Wars, they don't care about Star Wars. I don't believe that for a minute. J.J. Abrams cared deeply about Star Wars. And if you look at the documentary that accompanied The Rise of Skywalker, a film, by the way, that I love, so that's controversial too, probably, the care that went into it is amazing. I mean, I was particularly struck by this moment when they're designing a tiny little creature and they care about the eyes and they're doing all the kind of stuff. That thing gets 2 seconds of screen time in the Pisana shot. But I would suggest, in line with what Poe Dameron, Oscar Isaac said, that the care that went into that creature, the attention to the detail, somehow also makes it into the film. It's a little bit like the Ernest Hemingway thing about writing a short story and then taking something crucial out of it, but it resonates throughout the story and the audience gets more meaning as a result. I think that's there, and I think that's because of the care that people put into these Star Wars movies. I do think it probably would have been better if there hadn't been such a rushed production schedule for the sequel trilogy. But do I think there had to be an overarching master story that was agreed? Actually, that's not what happened with the first films. A lot of the things that we think of now as kind of set in stone from the original trilogy were very contingent and were very based on factors having to do with budgets and the availability of technology and the inability to create certain things. And that shaped the story that we got. Why didn't we see the capital city of the empire in the first trilogy? Too expensive to show it. So as a result, the storytelling puts us in the margins.
I think it'd be very interesting to see, and I'm not saying that I want to see this, a remake of the original one, to see how they would do it now. And I don't want them to do it. I absolutely don't, because the original is the original.
Floating around on YouTube, there is a wonderful piece of fan fiction which shows you what the battle between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader would look like if we had now the kind of fight choreography that has evolved over time. And
that's what I'm talking about.
It's pretty fun to watch.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about recreating the film. I'm just saying, hypothetically, what could it have looked like? And that sounds exactly like what they've done.
But then it's interesting that people will then go to that first thing and they'll try to they want it all to make sense. And in a certain way, in the book, I talk a little bit about the ways in which part of what Lucas is, I think, trying to do originally is to create a sense of mass entertainment in the way that Greek tragedy was mass entertainment. They were retelling stories. Audiences had expectations about them, and the stories drew on certain kinds of archetypes, but they didn't all make sense. There were conflict. I mean, if you wanted there to be one story of Oedipus or even one story of Odysseus or any, not true. There are many different storytelling traditions. And so people who want all of Star Wars to make sense completely is an interesting tension. Sometimes I think it's very productive. I love the fact that people say, well, the idea of like however many parsecs it is with the Millennium Falcon was able to do, that was clearly a mistake. They misused parsecs, but then it generated an extremely clever solution to that problem in the film Solo. Just like the offhand remark about, the Clone Wars. Well, that became a kind of constraint for Lucas himself and then for later artists to build on. So it's really interesting the way it works in that sense. It's almost like if Lucas drew from global archetypes through the work of Joseph Campbell, this next generation of Lucasfilm filmmakers not only have that, or not even as interested in that, they have Star Wars to draw on. And also all of those decommissioned novels and stories that are now legends, that has the function of kind of myth and archetype. So there's a kind of funny self-consciousness about all this thing, which I think is wonderful.
I'm going to move the questioning on to, we've got a lot of questions around the same sort of theme around, technology in terms of whether it's positive, negative, that kind of thing. So I'm going to go with the first one, which is from Igor, which is, do you have examples of good technologically based sci-fi?
Yeah, Star Wars. I mean, what does that mean, good? I do think, one of the things that science fiction is about it's a version of speculative fiction, and it's often about what might happen if certain kinds of scientific discoveries were to happen, or if we imagine that the world was slightly different because of different ways that technology might work. But I think what I'm arguing is that any representation of technology, because it is concerned with our relationship to the idea of agency. What is it that how do we affect intent, right? Agency is the ability to have an intention and to make that intention tangible in the world, to effect that intention. Now, technology is supposed to be a tool that enables us to do this. But as Asimov's quotes go out to saying about fire as the first technology in that sense, or first tool, if you will, we have always, he would say, been worried about the tools getting out of control or the tools being misused because they're amplifying our effects, our ability to affect our agency. But then even when you think about that notion of agency, it's very complicated. Like we typically say, an agent, that's somebody that we delegate to do somebody else. So we have our own agency. I have my own agency if I say I want to raise my hand and I can do it. Right? But what if I'm paralyzed and I need somebody else to raise it for me? I have to delegate that agency to somebody else. When we talk about James Bond as a secret agent, we have delegated a certain authority for him to act on Her Majesty's Secret Service, as it were. That agent doesn't always do exactly what he's supposed to do, right? So delegating agency is always a problem that we worry about. And insofar as that's built into technology, we are always going to be worried about it, which is why I want to say that we inevitably have a love-hate relationship with technology, so that even a film that completely celebrates technology might actually also have an undercurrent of technophobia, whereas a complete film that seems at first to be technophobic, I think might also have an undercurrent of the love of technology. I would say overall that Star Wars does celebrate technology and what we can do with it, but it wants to encourage us to think about what responsibilities we have when we create technology.
So moving on, still on the same sort of theme, to a question from Paul, aka Pictical. How much of technophobia is due to a lack of understanding of science and technology?
Hold on.
Oh, we might have a cat. We're all...
Oh, come on, cat. Cat. Come back, cat. Oh, wants to go get the blue milk. Hopefully, if I say cat, don't come, cat will come back. That cat's name is Inky, by the way, and he's a black cat.
We saw him. He exists.
Go on. I'm not joking.
Um, so yeah, as I said, Paul, aka Pitch Cool. How much of technophobia is due to a lack of understanding of science and technology, and how much is just conspiracy theory?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think it's just conspiracy theory. As I'm trying to argue that as soon as we created a tool, we worried about, as human beings, we worried about that tool being misused and not being under our control. I might even say the more we understand technology, the more we might actually get worried about it, especially nowadays when we think about technologies that seem to have actually just, we are in a certain way, we've all become cyborgs, right? I mean, we are all just attached to these things that we carry around all the time. And, my kids really can't exist without their social media and their technologies all around us. So I think actually, frankly, the more I learn about technology and how it works, the more technophobic I'm likely to become. And I'm an early adopter. I had to resist the temptation to stick OS Monterey on the computers before tonight because I thought it might glitch up something that we were trying to do. But I'm going to do it tomorrow.
Um, Next question again is from Igor. Igor is one of our more prolific question askers. Do you think technophobia is some innate property of humanity, manifestation of conservatism, or something astroturfed? That's a question.
Is astroturf a term that I'm not familiar with here?
I'm not sure myself. If we ignore that,
what I think is a property of so-called humanity is a love-hate relationship with technology, and really with anything that we create that is meant to extend our agency, because we fear that it can also rebound on us and diminish our agency. Right? I mean, people who talk about in the United States the need for gun control, the people that are gun advocates say, I need my gun to protect myself if somebody comes into my house. And the people say, no, what's most likely to happen if somebody comes into your house is that your gun will get turned on you. Right? So I think there's a kind of fear that we have, but also a desire that we have to use technology to give ourselves a leg up on somebody else, right? Maybe this goes back to what philosophers would call the state of nature, where we're looking for any advantage to preserve ourselves. And so we invented tools. And again, I think tools and technology is just tools writ large. It's something we've always worried about. So I think even when we love it, we also are worried about it. Even when we hate it, we're kind of drawn to it. Or
that sounded like a cat.
Where's my cat?
We have a cat.
His name's Inky. Say hi, Inky. Okay, Inky wants to go now. No way you're seeing his sister. She's very private, apparently. Or as I said, and while we were talking in between, she prefers women to men, so she's not cuddly to me. Anyway, go on.
I was going to move on to the next question, which kind of links back to one of the earlier questions, which was, does technophobia manifest in the humanoid AI movies like Her and Ex Machina? Or does it get perpetuated by these, or on the opposite, is it being reduced?
Okay, so I talked about RUR, which is where the word robot was coined. And in RUR, what happens is there is a dreamer who wants to create robots to be, to help humankind be free of drudgery and be able to realize its best intentions, to become artists and whatever. His son takes that project and perverts it. He wants to create basically slave labors. So that's why the word robota in Czech means servitude. It comes from that. So built into the very idea of the robot was creating slaves, right? And so that play itself was influenced by Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, which was about a doctor using technology to create something that is basically a place where human beings should not go, infringing, if you will, on the purview of God. Or you might say men trying to make babies without women present. In any case, in either sense, it doesn't work out very well, right? So I think movies like Her and Ex Machina are also kind of have these things in their genealogy. What does that mean? It means that in certain cases, I mean, if you look at Ex Machina, for example, which actually has two people who are in the sequel trilogy, Oscar Isaac and oh, I'm forgetting General Hux's name. It'll come to me in a second. But both of them, Domhnall Gleeson, both of them, are in some sense kind of in love with his technology, but they mistreat it in certain ways. I mean, Oscar Isaac is a Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein kind of figure who wants to create, and nothing likes to be mistreated, right? So they come back and turn on their creators. But this is even older than Frankenstein. Just think of the Pygmalion myth, right? The artist who creates out of art, out of some kind of technology or magic, and then wants to control it. But at a certain point, when you create something, this is true for parents too. Your responsibility is to let it go and flourish, and you have to learn to let go. So there's a certain way in which I think that those movies. I mean, I love Ex Machina. I think it's terrific, but I always worried about how she's going to get recharged at the end. But that's another thing. I think have those fictions in their background, and they're all about. Again, it's a little bit about the limits of human knowledge and whether we are creating things in good or bad faith. If we create something, we have a responsibility to it and to the other people whom it might affect. And I think that's what Star Wars and a host of other things are worried about and getting us to try to think about.
So I'm going to jump around a little bit here. We've got a question here from David, which is, how many times have you watched the Star Wars movies? Your
More
knowledge
times
is like...
than I could possibly care to admit.
But
No,
what I was also
a
about to
lot.
say, to add to this is, it's not just Star Wars. Your encyclopedic knowledge spans various different genres. You could just study just Ex Machina would be...
Well, here's something I learned from here's something I learned from writing the book that I just wrote, which is that I like Star Wars, and I thought that was one part of my brain that was working on that. A part of me also likes really what we might think of as very highbrow literary products. I wrote my senior thesis on James Joyce's last novel, which is basically not written in English. It's multilingual puns in almost every word. I've studied, and my favorite novel at the moment is Moby Dick. I've come to work on Shakespeare and Hamlet. And so I really like all of those different things and those, the bibliographies that go along with them. And then what I realized in writing this book is that actually it's not separate parts of my brain. They're all the same part of my brain. And lately I've really become interested in the notion that I call global cultural heritage. I'm interested in how things like, on the one hand, Hamlet, which is spread globally all over the place, is probably, in pre-COVID times, there was probably always a production of Hamlet on somewhere in the world. It has both inspired and antagonized new work into being. I mentioned Frankenstein. That also seems to become kind of global cultural property. One of my favorite recent books is a book that's called Frankenstein in Baghdad by the novelist Ahmed Sadawi, which is set during the Iraq War, and in which, somebody decides to pay homage to the dead who have been blown up in mines by putting together a body out of all these parts that can then be properly buried. And somebody is blown up and their spirit wanders and sees a body that it can inhabit, and then problems ensue, right? And of course, it becomes an allegory for the fractured state of Iraq and all this kind of stuff. So the funny thing about it is it's very self-conscious about its use of Frankenstein, but the most explicit Frankenstein reference it makes is not to Shelley's novel, not to Boris Karloff. No, it's to Branagh and De Niro's version of the story, right? So I'm interested in how things like Shakespeare and Frankenstein and, yes, Star Wars become part of global cultural heritage. And that's the book that I'm currently working on at the moment, just to look at different genres. In this case, it'll be epic, drama, lyric poetry to trouble the notion a little bit, the novel. And then for film, it'll be thinking about Star Wars. So how glad am I that Star Wars Visions just came out? I'm very glad. And not only that, here's a plug. I don't know her, but Emma Miyako Candon's novel Ronin is fabulous, and I highly recommend that you read it. It is, All I want to say about it is it takes off from the first episode of Visions, but it really takes the same materials and kind of reworks them almost in the way that Shakespeare took materials and reworks them. So let's just imagine that the major influences for Star Wars were the Western, Flash Gordon, with a little bit of Kurosawa, who I mentioned in the talk. Well, what if we gave priority to Kurosawa and we filtered all of these ideas through Japanese imperial history rather than US liberal history and Japanese understandings of empire and citizenship? What would it look like? I think it's a
Yeah,
fascinating and brilliant reshuffling
be a
of
really
these
interesting film to
elements. I
watch.
urge everybody to not only watch the show, but to read that book if they're interested in this version.
So we now have another question from Anonymous, which stays on the technological theme.
Is that
Um,
better?
are there any technologies with either no good or no bad uses? Are there any so biased that they shape the owner's choices
Is that better?
completely?
So again, what I said, one of the things that I think about is that technology is neutral. Technology is a tool. Technology has a lot of potential. If you have a hammer sitting on a bench, you can use it to build something or you can use it to bash somebody's head in. It
I was
depends
going
on
to go
what
with the
you do.
extreme example, nuclear. You
Yeah.
can make power or you can
Well,
make a bomb.
but
One is,
there is this conception that I refer to, and the nuclear thing is giving me pause, but the that I refer to, which is technological determinism, which sort of says that there are ideologies built into technology, and that in some sense, once we build it, we can't help but use it. So that once we build a nuclear bomb, we become a nuclear power, and that changes us, and that becomes part of our identity. The nuclear thing is another thing. It's like, yes, you can build bombs, but even then, if we're using nuclear energy for alternative energies to try to remedy the problem that we have
yep.
with burning coal and gas, nevertheless, it's also dangerous.
Oh, yeah,
Right? So
it
there's
is.
also that worry that that because technology maybe can have effects beyond what we intend, it might actually be bad for us. I think I made a reference to using
Maybe,
steroids, for
maybe a
example.
slightly different example than using it for medical. Radiation is used for treating medicine. That is you clearly a positive use of nuclear. Bombs, probably not so much a positive. So you've got the two sides, and it is, the technology itself is not inherently
Yeah, I
bad.
mean, again, that's my view, and I think that's also increasingly the Star Wars view, which is why I think that the storytelling has evolved to. I mean, I spent a little time talking about this weird thing called the Kyber crystal. Again, that's an element they took out of George Lucas's early drafts for Star Wars, but then have decided to make canonical and develop it, and it really becomes interesting that both the Jedi and the Sith make use of these Kyber crystals. That the lightsaber uses it, and the Death Star uses a lot of them.
I think that's a great point to bring up a question that Igor's brought up, which is: do you prefer midichlorian way to explain the Force, or the universe is mystical and magical? Don't think about it approach.
Uh, I have no preference because it occurs to me that if this is a real universe, and even if we call it that the Force is real, that there had to be competing explanations. I mean, just think about how human beings have explained natural phenomena over time. They create myths. Some people believe in God. Most people believe in God. Some people don't. Some people have their competing, even for everyone who believes in God, there are competing religious doctrines, competing explanations. So it only makes sense to me that in the Star Wars universe, there might be a biological explanation for the Force. There might be a more mystical explanation for the Force. There might be Force users beyond the Sith and the Jedi. Right now, I'm working on a little spin off essay that's about the Witches of Dathomir. And they have a very different way of thinking about the Force, and they think of it as more like magic and spells and something to manipulate. So I think and I think what we're going to see as we there's so you're already seeing this in the High Republic storytelling that's going on right now in books and comic books. We're looking at an earlier era of the Jedi, not as old as the Old Republic, but a couple hundred years before the films. And there's a different attitude of the Jedi towards things, and there's a different competing understandings of what the Force is. So I don't know. I don't think the midichlorians wrecked it. I am sort of glad that we got the trilogy that we got as the sequel rather than what Lucas said at certain points he wanted to do, which was to really delve into the macrobiotic world of the midichlorians. But that's probably because I prefer A Wrinkle in Time to what is the second one called A Wind in the Door, which is about going microscopic. So that's just me.
So the next question is a little bit off track in terms of what we've been talking about so far. What is your verdict on the new Dune, especially compared to the original? Now, I know you mentioned in the break you have seen it.
Yeah, I'm currently teaching, as you mentioned, at NYU's campus in Abu Dhabi, which got Dune a month earlier than the US got it. My family and I went to see it at the earliest possible show in IMAX. And my older son and I were absolutely transfixed and thought it was genius. I went in partial to believing that it would hopefully be that way because I really liked the work of Denis Villeneuve. I liked Blade Runner 2049, and I really like an earlier movie that he made called Incendie, which is an adaptation of a play by Wajdi Mouawad, which is about a place not unlike Lebanon at a time not unlike the Civil War and draws significantly on Oedipus. So I think he's a genius filmmaker. I think the film was great. My wife loves Dune. No Dune adaptation could possibly satisfy her, but she thought it was pretty good. So I think that's pretty high praise. What did I like about it? So, okay. So, I agree with David Lynch's taking his name off that film. I saw it in 1984. By the time that, Paul Atreides is riding the worm to the strains of Toto, I'm like, oh, please. The second time that Dune was made was a TV series, which I thought was okay because it expanded the storytelling a little bit. What I liked about Denis Villeneuve's version of it was it didn't really dumb it down for the audience, and it was slow. It was designed to be expository. It was designed to capture the kind of wonder of the desert world. I just thought it worked really well, and I am so psyched to learn, as I think I just did yesterday, that they've greenlit the second version of it. So I agree with all of the reviews that think it's genius. I just read a column by the New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, who praises Dune to the heavens, and I agree with that. He's very harsh about Foundation, the adaptation of Isaac Asimov that's going on. I'm watching it, and I will watch the next episode when it comes tomorrow. I have as a literary type, I have a high tolerance for all kinds of things. Even if they're not very good, I can find them interesting. And I can see why Foundation would have been hard to film because it's so talky, it breaks up in time, it doesn't have a kind of compelling through line for a lot of the time. So I actually think, if you want a Game of Thrones-ify Foundation, I'd rather you did that than I think it's fine too. But I think if I had to pick one thing to watch out of those two, I'd definitely recommend Dune.
Fantastic. There you go, audience. You know what to watch. Right. So Igor has another question here. Do you think that the abundance of dystopian fantasy is a sign of relatively stable times, people's need for additional thrill in boring times? I would say that I'd struggle to say that we're in a stable time right now, but
I was going to say there's a lot of dystopian fiction right now,
but I think that's his point, is that are they
necessarily
after the dystopian future? Because actually everything's great in the real world. We need a load of really messed up stuff going on to watch. But I wouldn't necessarily agree with that first part, that we're in a stable time.
I can't really think of a time when everything was really great in the world. Even when things were great for some people in the world, they were concomitantly really bad for other people in the world. I think the abundance of dystopian fantasy is related. I think the fact that we're seeing more and more of them is due to a couple of things. One of them is linked to what I'm saying about this kind of acceleration of technophobic representation because of the acceleration of technology, right? After the Cold War and the dropping of the nuclear bomb, it became possible to understand that technology might actually could literally destroy the planet. And now we have climate change. So I actually think that a lot of dystopian fiction grew out of worries that we have about the world, not necessarily that we're looking for thrills, because I don't think dystopian fiction is really escapist in that same way. So I'm not quite. I have to think about that. a little bit more. I would ascribe the abundance of dystopian fiction. The first thing is that it actually is a sign that we are really anxious about the future. But the second thing, of course, is that the way Hollywood and other producers work is that once one is successful, we start to try to get more of them until people sort of get tired of it. Will that mean we'll slip around to utopian fiction? I don't know. Utopia is not quite as interesting, I don't think.
So Anonymous asked us a question as well. What is the significance of a film that I haven't yet watched, but it's on my watch list, Metropolis, to how sci-fi movies were developed later? Did it set the standards?
Well, yeah, I mean, Metropolis is a genius work of early cinema that significantly draws on, I could have mentioned it today. It draws on RUR in terms of its thinking about the link between robots and servitude, but it's really a little bit about how an ostensibly utopian society for some in the upper reaches is a bleakly dystopian society for others. And that's going on at the same time as we have these people, the dystopian part of this is that people exist in a kind of mechanized world, right? It's like the people that exist in the lower echelons of the world at Metropolis, of the world beneath the glossy city, they exist almost as automatons themselves, mechanized. So we get a lot of imagery that has to do with workers and clocks and machines. And now you take that setup and you insert the robot into it. And of course, the robot in the aftermath of RUR gets out of control and leads a revolt. And so I think it's a fascinating, mixture of these two separate kinds of, or the ideas that are related to the idea of the robot, although they're coming from it from a slightly two different directions. Already a mechanized society, and now we put the robot into it. But if you look at the scenery that Lang created, I mean, clearly those influenced later on what, for example, Lucas would create in Coruscant, or what Isaac Asimov in Foundation actually imagines to be the capital world of Trantor, which is a precursor to Coruscant, which is this completely mechanized world. So I think, it was also a thing that if you watch it, it was epic. So I think that was part of the way in which it spurred Lucas's ideas. It was really interestingly about the relationship between urban societies and technological progress and what they're built on. So I think that becomes an important theme. I just think it's a massively important work in the history of science fiction that clearly influenced lots of works that came and probably still does. And the music is, that accompanied it and that has been recreated. Not the Giorgio Moroder's track, but I think is also an important part of it. So yeah, people who are interested in the genealogy of technophobic representations that I mentioned or of Star Wars should spend the time. I urge you to spend the time and watch Metropolis. It's in a full version now, which is really interesting because some footage was discovered and it's kind of it's messier looking, so you can tell what it is. But they've got a more complete version of the film than we used to have.
As I said, it's on my list of films. It's someone I've been told I've not got to watch, and I just haven't got round to it.
Recommend it.
We've not got a lot of questions left, so we're gonna just run through a few last ones. So Chromium 52 asks, most of your examples are from space opera or fantasy. Do you see your reasoning applying to other subgenres too, such as cyberpunk? Is his example?
Well, again, if you take like the classic cyberpunk novel, like one of the first ones, such as Neuromancer, we have you can see a lot of the same motifs that I was talking about today being reworked there, right? So we imagine a world now that is a parallel world to us that is called cyberspace. And then in some sense, and then again, this prefigures what we see going on in the Matrix, in some sense offers a kind of parallel reality that threatens to usurp our own reality. When Case jacks into the Matrix, or now into cyberspace in Gibson, he is in a kind of a war zone in which the real entities are kind of these AIs that have something to do with corporations rather than the nation state. So I think that cyberpunk is one of, and I think a lot of cyberpunk was really rooted in the kind of stories that have to do with rugged individualism that I was talking about, in hard-boiled detective fiction in the case of Gibson's first trilogy. And I think that again, I spent a lot of the summer going back and reading Neil Stevenson, and I think that that is his big novels. I've especially read Remedy and Seven Eves and Dodge or Fall or Dodge in Hell, which was about 3,000 pages between those three books. And I think those are also interesting reworkings, but they're always about, the idea of what happens to human beings through technology. If in the one that's called Fall, if we have our brains scanned and can go into a kind of parallel world, so this is a further iteration of the kind of thing that we see in Gibson's world, what do we become? What do we bring from the previous world? And how does this new reality get shaped? So I think cyberpunk and its offshoots are interested in the same sets of ideals, and many of them are offering sort of examinations or critiques of that mythology of rugged individualism that I was talking about.
So getting a bit in time, I've got two last questions. One that has been removed, but I'm going to ask it anyway, and I'm going to ask it in a format of one answer, one sentence as the the validation. Favorite character in Star Wars and why?
Han Solo, because I connect to, if I had to pick one, it's Han Solo because that was the one with whom I connected in the first film. Maybe because he shot Greedo first, but it was Han Solo, not Luke, and not Obi-Wan.
Absolutely. Valid answer. And then the final question, which we're going to leave to wrap up, which is going to be a lovely controversial one. Anonymous asks, what is the correct order to watch the Star Wars movies?
Whatever you say it is. I mean, there's a concept in cultural theory that's called rhizomatic, which suggests that instead of teleology, we need to think of kind of vines or things with nodes and multiple points of entry. People from my generation would say 4, 5, 6, skip 1, 2, maybe 3, 7, 8, 9, I don't know. Lucas says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. My kids grew up with the prequel trilogy. They loved those. They only went back to 4, 5, and 6 after watching 7 because they got interested in that. They wanted to see the backstory. That's because they loved the Jedi mythology, right? People in the future will watch them in a completely different order. They may come to The Mandalorian first, or they may watch the new series Ahsoka first, and then they'll go back. I don't know that there will be a correct order, and I think that's part of the interesting thing that Star Wars has enabled to develop. You can have multiple points of entry, and I think you will find that they will drive you to other points. So I think that question is a question that might be time-bound, that it won't be so pressing later on when there's so many different kinds of Star Wars to choose from. So that's what I would say.
And
what is the order that I asked my kids to do it in? I didn't even have a choice.
And I think it is very much. It's down to you how you choose to watch things. If you want to watch 6 first, watch 6 first. Look, however you enjoy it.
I know we're running short of time, but look, in 1980, I went with a whole bunch of people. We waited in line. We saw The Empire Strikes Back, and I write a little bit about this. I had this moment with all the holy armies of, oh my God, I am your father. It's like, no, really? Oh, is he lying? We waited 3 years to find out your father. He is, right? My kid clicked on a Lego website called A Story of Anakin Skywalker before I could stop him. And I'm pretty sure that he knew by the end of those 3 minutes that Anakin and Vader were the same person. So no moment of reversal and recognition for him. But if you watch them in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as Lucas says you should, you get a different compensatory experience. And we call that dramatic irony, right? We know more than the characters know. And that is an exquisite kind of tension that also is, I think, valuable. So, I believe that context shapes meaning, and so Absolutely. The order that you watch them in will shape your meanings, but you don't have to be bound by that.
And what a lovely way to end our Q&A tonight. That is, absolutely. So I'd like to say, first of all, thank you massively to Professor Patell.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you all for inviting me to share the moment in the virtual pub with you.
I'd also like to thank David and Matty, who have been our techs tonight, and Gerald, who has been my backup and managing the questions. We will be opening up our virtual pub in a few minutes, and the link will be in the chat. Our next talk is in 2 weeks, and will be Annika Harrison talking about the woos and woes of Wikipedia, an opportunity for skeptical activism or a conspiratory club. Remember that our clocks change here in the UK before that talk, so make sure you check your times correctly. That's all up for us tonight, so hopefully I'll see you all in 2 weeks' time at Annika's talk, in a few minutes' time in the pub, or next week, when, as always, we'll open up the lock-ins razor at 8:30 or on our Discord server. But for now, thank you very much, everybody, and good night.